Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. Journalists have embedded in military units since the early stages of the Iraq War. This positions reporters to show the complexities of war, but it also exposes them to the same dangers our troops face. We'll take a closer look at this journalistic technique today by talking with a reporter who, in her efforts to break the story, became the story. Join us on Inner Compass. My guest today is Kimberly Dozier, a reporter with CBS News who has filed hundreds of reports from Iraq and other war zones. She's written a book about the day this dangerous job almost cost her life. The book is entitled Breathing the Fire, Fighting to Report and Survive the War in Iraq. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you.
The practice of embedding is designed to provide the public with a richer, more accurate view and perspective on what goes on in military life. And you got maybe a much richer, fuller experience than you signed on for when you and your crew were hit by a roadside bomb. And we're going to come back and talk about that. But first I want to ask you about the ways that embedding differs from being a standard war correspondent. You're sticking with one unit, you stay in hotels.
Actually, there were many myths out there about embedding.
Okay.
Embedding, as it started in 1991 with the first Gulf War and the way it evolved, became entirely different things. Initially, embedding was a way for the military to control the U.S. media's access, and there were a lot of complaints about it. You know, yes, we'll give you access, but we will embargo this, we will not let you put this on the air, et cetera, et cetera. It evolved in Iraq in the invasion in 2003 as started the same way as access to the invasion, but then it evolved into one of the safest ways you could actually get to the story.
Really?
In 2003, 2004, as the insurgency started heating up and as kidnapping became a real problem on the streets, journalists who lived in the red zone, contrary to popular belief, not only did we not live in the green zone, for the first couple years, especially under Paul Bremer, the CPA administrator at the time, then the Congressional Provisional Authority, would not allow us onto the green zone. So we would only go when permitted for, say, a press conference.
So it was very controlled.
Very controlled. And you'd get to go out with the military occasionally to see what they were doing. But in those first couple of years, you would also spend a lot of time, say, in an Iraqi family's home or in an Iraqi marketplace or visiting government officials such as they were as the government tried to reconstitute itself. But as I was talking about, the rising danger, first the car bombs and then the roadside bombs that attacked first military vehicles, and then started targeting anyone who looked like they were a member of the CPA, anyone who looked foreign, anyone in a four-wheel drive vehicle, and the kidnapping, first of, say, Iraqi doctors or lawyers or anyone that they could, get money for. Then it started focusing on foreigners as these criminal gangs realized they could trade their hostage up to an insurgent group, even Al-Qaeda, to whoever the highest bidder was.
And at that point, it begins to get very dangerous for journalists.
And my bosses started asking, well, why should we risk you all going out the door?
Sure.
They were having to start to pay more and more for security, up to $1 million a month at the time. And we had one of the most modest security teams of any of the networks there. And there was a risk-reward thing in terms of viewership as well. The longer the story was on the air, stories from Iraq or Afghanistan, the less people wanted to watch it. And what happened was I would say to my editorial bosses in New York, I want to go stay overnight at this forward operating base. They're doing a raid. Oh, well, what's this raid? How is it different from the 24 other raids that you've been on and we've put on TV, or the same for a school opening, or the same for rebuilding an electricity plant. Nation building, as we were doing in Iraq, becomes a pretty boring story to tell.
Sure.
and punctuated by moments of violence that get you back on the air. But then after you do, say, 30 people killed in this car bombing, but then 50 in this one, and then 100 in this one, then you have another 30-person car bombing.
And nobody's interested.
And they're like, okay, well, we've done that. And so the calculation of going out the door became really tough to make. And I felt, even though as a correspondent, it's not hierarchical overseas, it's much more egalitarian. The camera crew, the producer, the correspondent, you make a decision together as to whether a story is worth going out for, because you need everybody's instincts to weigh in on something like that. But I still felt the responsibility that my face was going to go on the air. I was going to get the credit for being in the dangerous place, but I'd be taking everyone in there. So that's how we got to the day that I got injured and my colleagues were killed. It was a chance to embed just for a few hours with a team that was training Iraqi security forces. It was on Memorial Day. It was 4 months to the day after my colleague, ABC News correspondent Bob Woodruff, had been hit. So the military had all had to sign off on where we were going, and we knew we were going to get sent to a safe place because they weren't going to take chances with us after what had happened to Bob. And my bosses were like, okay, it's Memorial Day, slow news day, we'll let you go, we need the story. And my team was like, hey, don't risk my life unless you make air. That's what my cameraman Paul Douglas always used to say. And he said, this is the kind of story that'll make air. So that is how we ended up on that day embedding. And that's why just from 2003 to 2006 while I was there, we started very much operating within the military. Then the moment we got to Baghdad, we were out in the field doing what you'd think of as normal foreign correspondence work. And then we morphed back to mostly embedding.
I see. Okay, so for a while you had quite a lot of freedom to cover what you wanted to cover, but
until we became the
freedom,
targets,
you don't have the safety.
There was always also a calculation to be made. For a while there, it was safer to be on your own than to be with the military, because the military was the target. And then I blame Al-Qaeda. I blame what happened with Danny Pearl. Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups started seeing us not as a passport to get their message out to an audience, but as symbols of the occupier, symbols of the West. We were useful to them in orange jumpsuits
rather than alive.
Exactly. They didn't want to be on, unlike say Palestinian militants or Lebanese militants who were very savvy in using the foreign media. Now Al-Qaeda has the web. That's how they reach their audience. They don't need us. So they started lumping us in the same group and therefore targeting us. So the calculation you make is you might as well be with the guys who have the firepower to fight back. Was
the military pretty receptive to that? I mean, were they eager to take you on or in, or was that sort of a burden to them?
It's been a constant debate for them. Now, how an embed works is a press officer or somebody, back at headquarters will identify a unit, and then they'll approach the commander of that unit, be it, captain, colonel, general, and ask them, are you willing to take this media group in? Sometimes it's willing on a walk the plank thing. If it's a one-star general asking a colonel, these are my friends, will you take them in? They have to take them. But then it's up to each unit. How much access do they give these people? How much trust do they extend? And how much experience does that media team have? Is it Eric Schmidt from the New York Times, who's covered these things for years and knows how to put on a flak jacket and run for cover? Is it somebody who might normally write for a magazine back in the States and has never been in a war zone, and they're going to have to be
a real liability?
Yeah.
How much training did you get? I mean, I know that you carried a safety bandage in your flak jacket and so forth. You had some equipment. How did they prepare you for these situations?
Look, they never used to. I remember in London, before the Kosovo crisis, I had been approached by some security training companies. And they said, look, we're trying to teach the media that they need to know how to give some basic combat life-saving treatment in the field, what to do to avoid mortar fire, what to do, you know, because a lot of these guys were former military and had seen media types doing stupid things in the field. I couldn't get my bosses to pay attention.
But you wanted that.
Oh, I wanted it. But then in the run-up to the 2003 invasion especially, and even before that, because I was working in the West Bank and Gaza, I was based in Jerusalem. When journalists started being under fire on a regular basis and getting hit, our insurance rates started going up, and we got an insurance break if we had media hostile environment training. That's what basically got us hostile environment training across the board.
Can I ask you if there was a point at which you said, wait, this isn't worth it? Why should I risk? I mean, you wanted to report, and you wanted to report in a war zone.
I never said that.
Okay, no. Okay, you were up for this all along.
I didn't know anybody who
You just wanted to know how to handle yourself there.
Yeah, and you don't, you know, the funny thing is they talk a lot about being adrenaline junkies. Mm-hmm. And I try to differentiate. There is the adrenaline of getting to the story. Mm-hmm. And whether it is, I felt the same adrenaline reporting on the Northern Ireland peace talks when I was sleeping outside Stormont Castle in the small temporary tent that they'd set up for the press outside, and working my sources and trying to beat the other networks, you know, to get the next bit of the story. Could I get the draft of something before someone else could? And I felt the same way, heart in my throat, as I was driving into Baghdad in 1998 during the bombing then. You know, way before. It's about being first to something that is unfolding, that is history in front of you, and relating that back to other people. That's the adrenaline. This idea that foreign correspondents, and I prefer foreign correspondents as opposed to being called a war correspondent, because there's such a laden term that you know, it makes you sound so self-important. I'm a war correspondent. It's about getting to the story and telling it accurately. At the same time, in a situation like that, you have to have some skills and some equipment and some knowledge to mitigate the risk.
Did the military control much in those later days what you covered? Or I assume they didn't censor you, but if you put on a show on the air that they didn't like, would they maybe deny you coverage the next time?
You got blowback occasionally, sure. And it still happens to this day. In Afghanistan, you see a very savvy military media team moving in who understands every time you put some of these stories on the air, it can either help your cause
or hurt it.
Generate support on Capitol Hill, generate the funding that you need, generate the decision you want out of the NSC and the White House, or it can hurt you. And I think what most people in the military realize is that the media has become for them another part of the battlefield.
Wow. Yeah,
so they, you know, if they don't pay attention to us and feed us, we'll find something to put out there.
Sure you will.
Does this embedding process taint our coverage? Is there a push-pull? Absolutely, there's a push-pull. We say yes to the embedding process because it gets us access. They say yes to the embedding process because it gets the word out. And this can both burn each of us and produce great results. What I've found over the years is in 2003, 2004, a lot of the reporters covering this, we didn't know the military very well. You could especially see it among the guys, you know, young male reporters from Ivy League schools walking into a room full of
there could be a social
of sort of
disconnect there.
Either West Point officers or worse, you know, some young guys from a unit at Fort Hood who'd were still working on their GEDs or whatever, and there was this culture clash. And they didn't like each other. They were suspicious of each other. It showed in the reporting. It showed in the lack of access and the hostility in some of the answers you'd get from the troops. Over the years, we became people to each other. We got to know majors and captains and colonels who later became generals. And as the relationship built between the two communities, the coverage changed. So I think you're going to see, going forward, you're seeing much more sophisticated coverage of Afghanistan.
Because there's a level of trust there.
Well, there's a level of knowledge.
Okay.
Trust, knowledge. You see a lot more about military strategy. You see more accuracy in terms of when we're writing and referring to certain pieces of equipment or modes of travel. Sure. So, you know, the two communities have gotten to know each other in a way that I think is useful for the American public, because look at the picture of America writ large. Fewer than 1% of this country serves in uniform. Right. And fewer than 5% of this country knows someone who serves. So there's this vast audience out there, and I would have put the media in the vast audience of people who don't know much about the military. Now, you did know something about the military. You'd grown up in a military family. Yeah, a little bit. Okay. Dad was a World War II Marine, so it was always sort of in the background. But he was not on active duty as you were growing up then? No, okay. No. But it was always, we didn't have a, he didn't talk a lot about it. Okay. But I always had the awareness. My mom had been a Rosie the Riveter. Dad was a veteran. Dad would put up the flag in the backyard. My parents are, you know, registered Maryland Democrats. So that was my sort of upbringing. Did that steer you toward wanting to do foreign, now I'm trying to use your term, foreign correspondent, not war correspondent. Did you have a particular interest in reporting military operations? I never thought I'd be covering the military. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent because Dad did overseas construction. He suckered Mom into going to Guam because he'd been based there as a Marine. Well, they'd done the invasion of Guam, and didn't tell her about the 100-degree humidity or the coconut crabs, things like that. Oversight. And after there, we went to Iran and were there for the revolution. And, you know, gunshots in the square with curfew after dark. We eventually got evacuated out on C-130 military planes. So you grew up with a pretty good diet of adrenaline. I loved it. Yeah. And so I wanted to go back and become a reporter of the Middle East and Islamic militancy versus Islamic extremism. War and the military just came in with Iraq. I hadn't, when I first started covering the U.S. military in 2003, other than my dad being a Marine and me having a vague idea that, you know, I was okay with patriotism, and which some of my colleagues were a little uncomfortable with, I had no idea the difference in the ranks, the difference in the services. There's a lot to learn. Yeah. I mean, I was calling them all soldiers, including Marines, even though I was a Marine's daughter. I'm trying to learn the ranks from watching MASH episodes, but it's fuzzy to me. Yeah. And in my dad's time, there weren't as many ranks either, so it throws him off. That made me feel better. Well, you became the story in 2006. It took, what, about 2 years to recover fully? And it took less than a year. Unfortunately, the most frustrating part of this process, there have been some very rewarding parts of it, being able to tell the story of what happened at the bomb scene, the fight to keep us alive, right, then the fight to rebuild my body. And your book addresses all this in detail that I think is really helpful, both for understanding the perspectives and the things that you and your team struggled with, and for appreciating what's happening there. Well, the hard part, though, I found the hardest journey is moving beyond it. Yeah, right. You know, when I come to talk about the book or talk about the story, I'm ready. I'm like, okay, this is a chance for me to share this story, to teach. Mm. But it's the preconceptions and prejudices that follow the injured. Whether you've been injured in a traumatic car crash, or especially if you've been injured overseas, or even if you served overseas in a combat zone, fed by the media and Hollywood, there are certain preconceptions about a person who's been through that. And that's the part that I have found the biggest challenge, the hardest part to muster grace to deal with sometimes. You know, if I haven't had enough sleep for a few days and have been covering some tough stories, and all of a sudden someone hits me with a, "You're that woman from Iraq who was hit by the car bomb. How are the nightmares? Yeah. Do you still have flashbacks?" Thanks for reminding me. And I'm like, okay, Nightmares, flashbacks, finished the first month in the hospital. No, I didn't develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. No, not everyone who goes
and
to
you
the war
addressed
zone
that. You talked it
does,
through.
yeah.
You dealt with it up front, and there are many different ways to deal with trauma, but you feel that you've dealt with it, and you feel, and so in late 2009, you finally got to go back to Baghdad, but your bosses weren't eager to see that happen.
They were far more attuned to the public's reaction to me than I was. I'd been living overseas, and my tribe, it's people that do this, whether they're in uniform or aid workers or journalists.
That's home for you. That's your community.
Exactly. And so, you know, for them, once you're better, you go back to doing what you did, because everyone knows the passion that drives you to cover this, or, you know, to speak for those who can't, in the case of my job. And the hard part was, what my bosses were aware of was, first of all, they had all been through a hell that they had never expected to go through. Losing my colleagues, Paul Douglas and James Brolin. Journalists don't expect to lose people in the field.
Right.
And then seeing me on the edge of death and getting put back together. They didn't want to be responsible for that. And I understand that. Also, the public keeps writing me. Almost every week I will get an email saying, "Don't go back there. Oh, so good to see you standing in front of the White House in the nice suit." And I'm like, are you kidding me? I'd rather be sweating in the field in a flak jacket. But, you know, there's this idea of, you know, once you've been injured, people have trouble letting you out of the injured box.
There's a kind of selfishness to that. I mean, it's well meant, but...
So I was really frustrated with my parents, well, especially my mom. Whether it was me waking up in the morning and crying my eyes out because I remembered losing Paul and James, or me saying yes to an hour of punishing physiotherapy because they had to do certain very painful things with my joints, or they weren't ever going to work normally again. Right. But my mom just had, she'd been through enough of seeing me in pain, she wanted it to stop. And even down to bad diagnoses. I got a diagnosis of a bacteria that was threatening to kill me long after everyone thought I was all better. And my mom had said, "Don't tell her." So the doctor shut them out, and he said, "Look, here's what happens in a trauma situation. With parents and an adult child, in their minds, you're whatever age you last were when you left home. And the public writ large can be the same way. They mean well, they just want to take care of you. But the whole returning to normal, whether you're an injured journalist who's now recovered, or a wounded warrior, whether you're an amputee, whatever, your new normal is normal." And the hard part is leaving that definition of injured behind and being recognized not with pity for your injury, but respect that you survived. Okay, next.
And you've written, you know, that you can't let other people be your internal compass.
That's one of the hardest lessons through this whole thing. It's one of the constant lessons through this whole thing.
So how do you stay true to what's inside you? What drives you?
You know, a lot of practice, and it started early. When I was first getting into this business, I got told no a number of times. People, whether they're your loved ones or someone you work for or someone you'd like to work for, people are very good at pointing out why something won't work. And you have to say, okay, I hear you, but this is what I want, so I'll go this way or this way. And same thing in the hospital. I was told I would probably never walk properly again. And I sat there saying, okay, heard no's before, hear what you're saying. So you're basically, you're telling me this is going to be hard and it might not be perfect. Okay. You push on through that. And so that becomes the inner compass that, you know, and it doesn't, it's not like you hear the bad news and then you go, yeah, okay, it's all right. No, first there's it hits you like a kick in the stomach. And then as you recover from reeling from the blow, you say, okay, wait a minute, I've been knocked down before. What did I do last time? Oh yeah, okay, I ignore them. So
So you take what you can and you learn from what you can, but you have to finally be driven by your own
and why you do it.
motivations. Yeah.
In my case, I had to recognize the fact that I love reporting the news. So that's part of my compass. You know, the speaking out for people is one part of it. The other part of it is just being there as something is unfolding and being part of it unfolding and affecting what happens by the very reporting of it.
Would you like to be back in the Middle East? What's your ideal job right now?
You know, to be in Pakistan or Afghanistan right now would be fantastic. To be in Dubai, going into either of those places where there's a political story, there's a diplomatic
Something
story.
simmering.
There's a lot going on behind the scenes that is hard to get to. And it's one of those places where relationships matter, long-term relationships with Pakistani officials. That's how you find stuff out, being the eyes and the ears on the ground.
Well, we look forward to seeing the reporting that you're going to do from wherever you are. Thank you so much for your time. My guest today has been Kimberly Dozier, CBS News correspondent and author of the book, Breathing the Fire, Fighting to Report and Survive the War in Iraq. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.